Greetings from Tokyo. My name is Daisuke Beppu, and happy Halloween. Continuing with this Halloween theme, I'd like to continue with my discussion of the films of Dario Argento. Today, if you don't mind, I'd like to speak to you about the 1987 film called Opera. Is the Blu-ray of the film Opera. This is, according to the back, a brand new 2016 2K scan with over 45 hours of extensive color correction done in the States. And there is an interview with Dario Argento, and there is an interview with star William McNamara, and there is a brand new 5.1 soundtrack and an original trailer. And there is an English soundtrack, so there's no Italian soundtrack. And if we open it up, we just see the disc. There's no booklet, at least not in the copy that I received. And there we go. That's it. A very bare bones Blu-ray, although there are some supplements in the form of interviews. At this point in time, I understand that shameless or cult films, or maybe a combination of the two, I'm not sure, will be releasing a version of Opera very soon. So I'm looking forward to that release. But until then, I'm relying on this particular release from Scorpion Releasing. So now let me talk to you about the film proper. And in order to do that, I will have to be going into some details. And so if you haven't seen the film yet, I highly recommend that you stop this video and watch the film, because I don't want to spoil the film for you if you haven't seen it. Again, I will be here, and after you have seen the film, you can take your time. You can come back anytime you want. It doesn't have to be soon. It can be as long as you need, and I'll still be here. This video will still be here, and we can always talk about the film at your own leisure and pace. So, what do I think of this film? I think this is one of the great masterpieces of Argento's output, and it is a true masterwork. In many ways, it can be said to be a kind of summing up of themes and ideas that Dario Argento has been working on since the 70s, since Bird with the Crystal Plumage, and onwards, of course. So this feels almost like a summing up of his work from the 70s and 80s, and it comes at a time in his career, as you know, where after this film, Argento will go to America and start a new phase in his filmmaking career. So in many respects, this is one of the last maybe great films that we'll see from Argento. Who knows? Maybe as I go along in the series, we'll find some more masterpieces along the way. But for the most part, this is one of the, or probably the last great masterpiece from Argento from the 1980s. And why is that? Well, there are many aspects, as I say, that I think call back to Argento's own cinematic filmography. For example, I think the use of opera and music is quite extensive here. We have, for example, Macbeth, Verdi's Macbeth being used. We have Bellini, I think it's Bellini's Casta Diva, from the Bellini opera Norma, and we have other sort of arias that are used or employed throughout the film, interspersed with which are very interesting heavy metal type tracks, and also that 80s style synthesizer, prog rock style music. So you've got a very eclectic mix here, punctuated, of course, by these really famous opera tunes and arias from famous operas. And of course it's fitting because it's a film called Opera, and it's set in an opera house, and it involves an opera diva, a young opera diva, Betty. So this use of opera is very important, and we've seen Argento use opera in the past, of course, but here opera is used quite triumphantly, I would say, and it is used in a way to add suspense and add irony to films. There is a really great use of opera in the scene where Betty is trapped in her apartment and it's dark and she doesn't know which policeman is the good guy and which policeman is the bad guy. And the use of music is also very peculiar because during the scenes of murder, what he'll do is he'll employ heavy metal or hard rock heavy metal kind of music, which is very jarring and very disruptive, and it's a very jarring juxtaposition of sounds, which I think is to the benefit of the film, because it shocks you. It certainly shocks me when I hear it, and this is sort of a nice juxtaposition with this whole notion of opera. We have this beautiful opera music on the one hand, and then suddenly during these scenes of murder and violence we hear this huge uproarious, quite vicious sounding heavy metal stuff, which is a brilliant juxtaposition. And it always occurs during these scenes of violence or murder or other scenes of danger. We've seen this, of course, this use of music in Phenomena. Of course, we've seen Phenomena, that soundtrack employ certain elements of heavy metal, sometimes in very odd places, arguably. So it doesn't usually occur during the murder scenes there necessarily, but in this film there seems to be a kind of structure employed with respect to how the music is used, which I really appreciate, because it adds a level of, how should I put it, there is a sense that someone is steering the ship, if you know what I mean, and Argento seems to be in control. And then there is a thing that happens in this film which is very reminiscent of other films, namely the use of the eyewitness. So we've seen this, for example, very famously in The Bird with the Crystal Plumage at the very beginning, where the protagonist, Sam, witnesses some violent act trapped between two panes of glass. We also see the Carl Malden character listen to a particular conversation at the beginning of Cat O' Nine Tails. Of course, we have Marcus Daly, the David Hemmings character in Deep Red, witness something at Helga Ullmann's apartment at the beginning of the film. In Tenebrae, we have Gianni, the young Gianni, witnessing something at the house of Cristiano Berti, and he hears also something that's said that triggers something, and he thinks he has seen something important. And also at the beginning of Suspiria, Susie Bannion sees something in the rain as Pat Hingle leaves the school, something to do with secret and irises. So here, in opera, we have that theme, but there's a twist on the theme. I don't think Betty, who is the protagonist, is witnessing anything in particular that leads to some kind of clue to solve the crime. Here, the witnesses are the birds. So the opera employs these birds. I think they are crows. And they are used as part of the stage, a set dressing on the stage. So it's a very kind of maybe an avant-garde production of Verdi's Macbeth. And so these crows are in this cage at night, and then the killer is doing something with a piece of wardrobe, fashion wardrobe or dress, and the birds witness this. and the killer very violently kills, attacks some of the birds, and the birds witness this. So then this is used as a means by which to trap the killer, because the birds later in the film are then released into the audience, and it is known that the killer is in the audience. So the birds remember who attacked them, and so they're flying about and they're looking for the person who attacked them, and then they finally find the killer, and then they swarm on him, and then they attack him. Well, this is a very interesting twist on that Argento theme of witness to some kind of important event. Here the witnesses are the birds, and the important event is the killer's attack on the birds. So that's an interesting kind of twist on the tale. And also we have animals or birds playing an important role in the thrust of the narrative, much like the chimpanzee played a very critical role in the thrust of the narrative of the film Phenomena, which is just 2 years prior. There is unfortunately also an unpleasant element that recalls earlier Argento films. So undeniably there is violence that is committed on some of these birds. Now I don't know what the background is for the production regarding these birds, but it seems pretty obvious to me that some of these birds are really being like hit and maybe even killed. I'm not sure. It seems pretty convincing to me. It doesn't look like a special effect. And so if that's the case, then it's very disturbing. Again, we have another instance of Argento's films, including scenes of animal cruelty. And I hope I can be proven otherwise. If you have any information about this particular scene, please let me know in the comments. I'd be very happy to hear it, but unless I hear any information, or unless I find any other information to the contrary, I have to think that what I'm seeing on screen is actual violence being committed on real live animals. And if that's the case, that's really unpleasant. Again, this is something that we've seen in other Argento films, unfortunately. We've seen this in Inferno with cats and mice, and we've seen this in Suspiria with live maggots. We've seen this in Deep Red with needles in lizards, and it's completely unnecessary. So it's unfortunate that this has to occur here. And I think it's even more unfortunate perhaps because I think the birds form a very critical part of the narrative. And so I think this violence on the birds, it is very crucial to the narrative, because it then makes the birds remember what happened, and then therefore they can exact revenge later on. But it is something that has to be mentioned, because it is quite unpleasant to watch. Let me put it that way. I think the character of Betty is a very well-rounded and interesting one. She seems to be a character that is trying to define herself beyond her looks and her beauty and her sexuality. You see this when she is kind of being hit on by the opera director, and you see this kind of in her kind of sexual interactions with her boyfriend. The implication being that she is maybe not into sex, and that she is kind of resistant to the idea that there has to be some kind of, that she has to be defined in terms of her sexuality. And I really appreciate that. I really admire that, because it shows that she is trying to be something more than what the typical cinematic conventions of this kind of film demand a character like her to be. Then we have the Argento elements, and I must say that the image of the nails or the pins on the tape, and they're taped to her eyes, under her eyes. This is one of the most iconic images. No, strike that. I think this is the most iconic image in all of Dario Argento. This is the cover of the Blu-ray. So take a look at that. This is an artist's rendition of this look, of course. It's not the actual look, but this is very frightening. It's very frightening. It's a very cold, violent thing. There is this idea of watching and witnessing, and this is very similar to, as I said, the act of witnessing that we usually see in giallo. This is also very similar to the act of witnessing and wanting to watch, being a peeping Tom that we saw in films like Rear Window of Alfred Hitchcock. And of course, there's a strong link between Argento and Hitchcock, as we know. But at the same time, there is something forced about the witnessing, of course, because we cannot close our eyes. So while we are witnessing something, what we are witnessing is something very horrific and terrible. So therefore, we want to look away, but we cannot. And this is the perfect physical expression, perfect metaphor for that kind of theme. And I think it's a brilliant image, one of the most perfectly realized metaphors for the complexities of violence and Argento's giallo films is this image of Betty with the pins taped under her eyes. So yes, we are dealing with iconic imagery in this film that is pure Argento, and this goes towards the set pieces of the film. I mean, there are some glamorous, glorious, violent set pieces in this film. The first murder, which is very violent, involving this weird spade-like knife going through the guy's neck there, and you see it through and just the blood splatter and the kind of it seems like a retractable knife. It doesn't seem quite real, and that recalls the retractable knife type that was used in the beginning of Suspiria. It doesn't seem quite real, and yet there is an evocation. It evokes real, just primal fear and violence, and it's relentless too. And there are other great set pieces as well. Probably the one that sticks out the most is the one with the birds, and they fly through around and around in the opera theater, and you have the camera going through, and they're just going round and round and round, and it doesn't cut, and it just keeps going, and it glides over these people, and then we suddenly are just over these people, and they're attacking these people, and it's this amazing thing. And then we see the birds ascend onto the killer, and they don't just ascend, they really go for it, and they go for the eyes and try to pluck out an eye. And we, just in case we didn't catch that, Argento gives us a close-up of a bird trying to gobble up an eye, which is one of the just most absurd, one of those great absurdist images in all of Argento films. The bird with the eyeball in its beak, and it's trying to swallow it, but it doesn't quite get there. It swallows and it regurgitates back up, and it does it again. So it's kind of hard to chew, which is just a horrible thing to think about. But anyway, so there's the eyeball stuff. But for me, the highlight has to be the gunshot through the peephole, and this is the death scene, the unfortunate death scene of the Dario Nicolodi character. And of course, this is set in Betty's apartment, and Dario Nicolodi's character is looking through the peephole. She's really scared because outside she suspects that the murderer is outside the door, and so but she doesn't know. Is it the murderer or is it a real policeman? She doesn't know, and so she's trying to figure out who it is. And the guy outside says, "Oh, look, you can see my gun here. That means I'm a real policeman." And then Dario Nicolodi's character says, "Wait a minute, I want to, don't show me the gun, I want to see your face again." And then her eye is right up to the peephole, and then suddenly, boom, And not just a boom, we get a huge slow motion close-up of an oversized bullet. And it just goes through, and then we see something go through the head of Dario Nicolodi in slow motion, with her cry of agony being stretched out over the soundtrack there in slow motion. And then, just for good measure, a phone in the distance is exploded, and then we see her body flail, and then it just falls over, and then boom, she's dead. And then, just to be sure that we know she's dead, we get a nice cut into her face, and we see that just the violence that has been committed on her face. It's quite shocking. So we have just wonderful bravura elements here at play. We have a telephone that explodes, which reminds me immediately of a telephone that's very important in the climax of the film Phenomena. We have a huge bullet, and it's a slow motion bullet, and this is very interesting because this is very reminiscent of Alfred Hitchcock. I mentioned this in an earlier review, but Alfred Hitchcock's film Spellbound comes to mind because that involves a giant gun at a certain in a certain scene. So here in Argento, we don't have a giant gun, but we have a giant bullet that just flies through the peephole. And then we have this idea of, flying through and something attacking. So it has a kind of, it almost recalls like 3D, something that penetrates through the screen and just kills you. So it's a fantastic, over-the-top moment. One of the great kills. Really shocking, really well done, very how should I put it, it's surprisingly not bloody in the sense that we see lots of blood splatter and all that stuff, but everything is enhanced by the sound and the slow motion and the shock of seeing a large bullet fly through the peephole. So all these elements are layered upon each other to create this huge impression in our minds of one terrible violent act that is being committed on a human being. And this is the power of Argento's cinema. We don't see blood and guts necessarily. We see the aftermath, of course, which is a makeup appliance, but the actual stuff that happens isn't. We don't see something that is gratuitous or violent. Everything is very. Every element is tuned in precisely to create this impression, psychologically speaking, in the minds of the viewer about this terrible, violent act. And it is a pure act of genius. It is one of the great moments, my favorite moment in this film perhaps, and thus one of my favorite moments in any Argento film. When I was younger, I found the ending to be a bit anticlimactic because the killer was just apprehended and arrested, and that was it. And then we had Betty with her famous or infamous scene in the grass. But now I think that the ending is, as I suggested earlier, a nice touch, a kind of meta touch to show that Betty is trying to be her own character. It could also be an indication of her falling into insanity. I'm not sure. But also, and I think it is an indication, is it not, of Argento's, I want to say, optimism. Because up to now we've been ending on moments of violence, and then the film ends. So, for example, Tenebrae ends on a very sudden moment of violence, and the film ends. Deep Red is the same way. Suspiria and Inferno involve destructions of places, and Four Flies on Grey Velvet, similar thing. Cat o' Nine Tails, of course. But we don't usually get scenes of, let's say, kind of resolution or human connection or interaction. We do get that in Phenomena with the Jennifer Connelly character and Inga the chimp. Here we get Betty. She is alone. She doesn't have any other human there or any man or woman there to connect with. It's just her and her own monologue, inner monologue and thoughts, and that's it. But it's something that I think could be interpreted to be a kind of a triumphant end for her. I mean, she has vanquished the killer. She has escaped with her life. Not only does she frolic through the grass, but she sees, I think it's a lizard, and the lizard is trapped and it can't escape, but she frees the lizard and the lizard is allowed to go free. So this is a very important scene, right? Because it is suggestive of her kind of freedom, because as I said, she is a character that is trying to define herself for who she is, not for what others are trying to impose upon her, whether it be the opera director or her boyfriend or the killer who's trying to impose his idea of her as being like her mother. No, she is who she is, and therefore she is being freed as a result of the murderer being apprehended, as well as all these other people who have been killed around her. So in that sense, I think it is a very optimistic ending, and one that I think has a lot of respect for the character of Betty. So let me end it there and just say in conclusion that Opera is a masterpiece and it's one of my favorite films. I'm not sure if it is a contender for my favorite Argento film, but it is certainly up there, and I look forward to trying to place it in my ranking of Argento films at the conclusion of this video run-through of his films. If you have any questions or comments about this film, Opera, please feel free to leave your comments down below. Please tell me what you think. Do you like this film? Do you think it's a masterpiece, or do you think it's just okay? Or maybe you don't like it at all. Please let me know. And I'd be very happy to address those comments to the best of my ability. Next time, we will be discussing one of Argento's films that he made while in the United States. This is the Black Cat section of the film Two Evil Eyes. So until that time, my friends, I hope you are happy and healthy and well, and please keep watching a lot of great films. Until we meet again, my friends. Cheers.